Hey guys, Michael here from Dapper Raptor, and in this video I'm going to go over how to set up the three different types of volumes with spline-based blocking and trigger volume, as well as going over the various settings. Check the timestamps in the timeline as well as the description for different chapters of the video to get the one you need specifically. So this process is really simple. All I've got here is the default third-person template map. I've gone ahead and just removed all the bits and pieces from it, and I've added spline-based blocking and trigger volume to the project. And other than that, nothing else has changed. If we hit play here, it's just the standard setup. Nothing different. So let's start with adding a passive blocking volume, and we'll use the passive blocking volume to create a border around the world. So to do this, we want to navigate into the SBBTV folder and then into the blueprints folder, and we want to find BP underscore SBBTV underscore spline volume. And this is the actor you will use for all spline volumes. Now, to use this, we just drag this into the world, and we want to find a place to put that. Let's go maybe like here. And we're going to use this to shape our spline. Now, personally, I find this easiest to position it and then switch to top-down view. One thing to note is that we are using a single-sided spline here, so we're going to want to make sure it's facing the right way. You can make it double-sided if you want, but for our purposes here, we only need it to be single-sided. So now that it's positioned, I'm going to switch over to top-down view, and I've got it on unlit just to make it easier to see where I'm going. Now, in perspective view, these handles make things a bit easier. I find that in top-down view, it's actually useful to turn them off. So if you just go to mark all spline points, you can turn that off, and now we just see the spline. And for some reason, that spline is not on grid. There we go. Now, if you haven't used splines before, this might look a little bit strange. It might look like vertices, but these things are actually called spline handles. And the way these work is you can hold Alt to make other ones, and then if you move them around, it's going to work like a line in Photoshop where these handles define the curve you have, and then you can click on the tangents here and change the way the curve is shaped. So we're going to basically just use those to build out our spline. Now to begin with, I'm just going to go along, and how many have we here? 4. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a really basic shape. It's going to look a bit weird at these corners, but that's okay. We're just going to hold Alt and continue to duplicate these out, and we're going to position all our points, and then we're going to worry about the shape of the spline. So basically what I'm doing is I'm placing one at each corner and then holding Alt to get another one, and I'm just doing that the whole way around. So when you're moving it, you don't want to hold Alt, obviously. And that is it there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go along and fix up these curves. So for instance, with this one here, we want to make it so it's flat like this. And we can change the actual shape of the curve. So there. And then this one here, we want to also bring this one down. And ideally it would be on grid. So let's like that. So that gives us a nice curve along there. So we're just going to go along and do the same thing for these. Unfortunately, when you make these new handles, it gives you these horrible tangents by default. So it's a little bit frustrating, but it is still much quicker than the normal blocking volume system. So we've got the same curve going there. And I'm going to adjust this tangent now. And the good thing is that the way the tangents work, by default, unless you go into the spline and change a point type, it's going to give you tangents that resize both sides at once. There's a lot more you can do with splines than just making really simple curves like this. I will leave that for you to learn in your own time though. But you can click on the spline and go through and change all the actual spline settings, and that should work fine with SBBTV. Might have some scenarios where the different settings are a bit weird, but that gives us our nice rounded corners there. Now, if we switch back to perspective, you can see we've already got this all set up, and we've got some curves going, we've got our material running. So that's actually going to work straight off the bat. If we hit play, that's going to stop players straight away because it's set up by default to block pawns. Now, it will not stop other actors. So we're going to go through and just really quickly make a new physics actor. So we're going to create a new blueprint class, and we're just going to create a ball. So let's go example ball. And in here, we're going to add a sphere. Going to make the sphere our root, and then we're going to tell the sphere to simulate physics. So if I hit compile and save on this, and we just find our player start, which is there, drag in a ball, lift it out of the ground, we're going to be able to push this ball around, but it's just going to go straight through even though we don't. And that is because the collision on this is only set up by default to block pawns. If we want it to also block physics bodies, we want to find this setting here, affected collision channels, expand that, add another one, and we can tell it to do physics bodies. And that will now block physics actors as well. Oops. So if I push this, you can see that that's getting stopped there. So that's a really useful setup to do. You can add as many channels to this as you want, including your own custom ones. This is literally just the built-in engine enumerator, so any collision channels you add within the project settings will appear in there as well. So that is a passive blocking volume, and that's probably what you're going to use mostly from SBBTV. That is, in my opinion, the most useful function it provides. However, we do have an active blocking volume. Now, to set this up, the way the active blocking volume works is when the player or any actors it's meant to interact with, so this ball, for instance, because we have physics bodies there, whenever they hit it, they will get thrust backwards. So if we switch this over to pass active by just changing the volume type, that won't work instantly because we need to go into our player and just add in one or two little bits of logic. This is really simple, so let's open up our third-person character. And we just want to find our collision component, which in this case is a capsule. Scroll down here and we want to find on component begin overlap and on component end overlap. We're going to add each of those. And then we want to use a library function that comes with SBBTV here. So we drag off of this guy here and we type in volume actor test. And there should only be one. I'm going to just hook up other actor to other actor, other component to other component. And for begin overlap, we want to make sure this new overlap is enabled. For end overlap, we want to do the same thing, volume actor test again. And we want to hook up the references here and make sure new overlap is disabled. For the interacting actor reference, we just want to get a reference to self. So that same reference can be used for both of those. Now, you can find out if the interaction was handled, so if you have a bunch of complicated systems that run on overlap, that is able to be accounted for there, but we're not going to go into that here. The last thing for pawns specifically, we want to go to class settings and click on add interface. We want to type in SBBTV and look for the SBBTV player interface. Down here under interfaces, you should compile just in case. Expand this and we want to get character ref and we just want to type in a reference to self here. So that is now working on the player. On the ball, however, we need to do the same overlap logic here. So click on our sphere, go to on component begin overlap and on component end overlap. Same thing, volume actor test, and this time we're just going to copy and paste that to do down here, hook up all our references, and then get a reference to self here. Make sure new overlap is selected here, and that should now work. So if we push the ball into this, we can see it pushes the ball back. If we walk into it or jump into it, it pushes us back. So that is the active blocking volume setup. For any actor that you want to interact with this, you will need to just add that overlap logic. What I would recommend, and in general what you should do, is have all your physics actors be parented to the same or a couple of classes so that they can all be done in one go instead of having to do it for each one. So if you have a ball, a cylinder, and all that sort of thing, you would have them all parented to one physics actor class. Now, the last thing we want to do is set up a trigger volume using the spline-based blocking and trigger volume. So we're going to go back into our blueprints folder within SBBTV. We're going to drag in a new instance of the spline volume, and we're just going to make sure we've got that facing the right way. Let's make some sort of shape here. Let's just make it more or less a circle. So because we're only using small distances here, the tangents are actually pretty decent. Let's just do something like that. That'll do. So this is going to be our trigger zone. So what we want to do with this one is we want to go down and find the volume type, switch this one over to trigger. Now, what are we going to do when the player walks into this? How about we spawn a new instance of this ball? So let's jump into our player. We will get a target point so we can define where the ball's going to spawn. I'm just going to position that more or less over there. That'll do. So let's go through and make a new event, custom event. Let's call this trigger ball spawn. We're going to get actor of type, or class, sorry. And we're just going to, there's only one target point in this level, so we're just going to use that. Obviously, you would want a better situation in your game. You would have a manager for all these sorts of things. We're just going to use that. And we're going to get world location. Get location. Get actor location, that's what we're looking for. From here, we want to just go through and spawn actor from class. I'm going to use the ball. And we only really want this to fire off once. So let's just do a do once at the beginning. In here, we want to split out transform so we can use that location. Rotation and scale can just stay the same. And that's really all we want to do. So let's delete this one. And we need a way to actually call this. So that's where our trigger comes in. We can go to this one here. And we have this trigger class setting here. Now in here is a couple of example ones. So like for instance, example print. If we set that up and we walk over this trigger, it's just going to trigger the print. If we want to create a new trigger class, if we go into the blueprints folder and then into the enum folder, we have this one here, SBBTV trigger class. We can add a new enumerator and let's call this spawn ball. If we hit save, we will now see that spawn ball is available here in our trigger class. Once that is done, we can go into our library and we will have the option to add spawn ball logic here. So for this, I haven't got an interface set up on the player, so we're just going to use casting. Cast to third person character. I'm going to put this down here, and off of here we're going to say, what do we call it? Trigger ball spawn. So if it's successfully cast to the player, we will trigger the ball spawn. And that should be everything we need. So what we should see happen is we should walk into this volume and a ball should spawn down from the top. And there we go. So you can see how we set it up to only do once, so that's only going to fire off once. And that ball obviously is going to be blocked by that. So that is how you set up passive blocking, active blocking, and triggers with spline-based blocking and trigger volume. The next section of this video we're going to do is just going to go over all these settings here roughly and what they do. There is a written version of all the settings documentation, so if you would prefer to check that out, then thank you very much for watching. But otherwise, let's go through this. So let's start off with the size and shape ones. Segment length defines the section of the spline segment. So if we jump into collision here, you can see that each collision section here is 1 meter long, or 100 units by default. If we switch this over to 500, you can see we get much less collision volumes added. However, it does give you a less well-defined curve. Now, in a lot of scenarios, you're going to want to find a happy medium that gives you a nice mix between not having too much collision and not having bad curves. So in this case, we might go with something like 400. because our curves here are roughly 400 in length. And that gives us, actually, it looks like maybe we might want closer to 350. 375. There's probably some sort of maths equation I can do here. I mean, that gives us a diagonal curve, but you get the idea. So it's sort of just playing around, and in some scenarios you might want separate splines for a corner to get really high definition curves. So like with the 100, you get much nicer curves there. And in general, the engine is really good at managing these collision volumes because they are so simple. So you just play around with that and work out your best setting. The next one we have is height, which is, as it would suggest, the height of the volume. So we can set that to 100, we can set it to 1000 if I actually put in the extra zero, and that gives you your height. The next one is volume thickness, and that does, as it sounds, is the thickness of the collision volume. So we can set that to 500. Now, sometimes the engine doesn't add the collision. You can just clear this and reset it. That gives us a thicker volume. That also works with the double-sided setting. So it will move the other side of the volume to that distance. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to turn collision off again for this now. And we'll put that back. So hidden at runtime is what it sounds like as well. If we hit play right now, we can see these volumes. So we'll use the trigger volume as an example. If I click on this trigger volume and hit hidden at runtime, even though it's visible in the editor, it is no longer hidden, no longer visible here, but you can see it still triggers. So most of your invisible walls and triggers are probably going to be hidden at runtime. Double-sided is, as I showed, it makes the volume visually double-sided. So if you are, excuse me, if you are adding in visuals, so if you're making a force field or something, and you do want it to be seen from both sides, you will want to enable double-sided. Use override material is also as it sounds. So if you have a material, let's just make a real quick one here. Example. So let's just give it a color. Let's just make it, I don't know, green. Not metallic and fully rough. So we just got a really basic green material. If we click use override material, it's not going to do much by default. It's going to get confused. But if we click this, we now have our example material on there. So if you grab a force field material off the marketplace, or you want to make your own or whatever, you can use that to use on the spline volume. Now, it is worth noting that the UVs of the spline are going to depend on this segment length. As such, it can be useful to use weld-aligned materials so that you don't have to worry about the UVs, but that's something you can play around with. So if we turn that back off, then we have all these volume material settings here. So these are settings for how this volume looks. I'm going to use the trigger volume again because it's a little bit easier to see. So we've got settings for the distance fade. So the distance fade is essentially at distance, this will fade in and out. So if you turn that off, it will always be visible. If you have it on, it'll fade out. So you get a sort of a nice effect where the player can't see the so I'm looking at the far wall over here, can't see the border, but as they approach, it starts to fade in. And as they get closer and closer, it's more faded. It's not quite working because we have a depth fade on here. You can change the minimum and maximum opacity as well as the distance at which those kick in. We also have the base color. So the base color, if you turn that off, you just have a grid. The base color itself is the setting here, or the color you're using on it. And then we can set it to be solid so there is no depth fade. Probably a better example would be using this one. So this one is using a depth fade, and because we have nothing behind this, it's immediately going transparent. If we turn it to solid, we now have a solid color. We can also make the base color emissive, and we can use a color boost to make it brighter. So you have this horrible thing here. Yeah, you get the idea. So then we have the grid, and that's more or less the same settings for the grid. So you have the ability to turn the grid on and off. You can change the color of the grid. You can change the tiling, so you can make it really big or really small. You can set the grid to emissive or not, and you can change the boost of the grid so you have a really bright grid. So that is the volume material settings. So let's move on to the configuration. We've gone through what the volume type is and the 3 different settings there. If you hover over them, it does give you a brief description of them as well. We've also gone over the affected collision channels. We have one-sided collision, so one thing I didn't demonstrate is if we were to add a volume, another volume in, and we go, let's add this over here, and we'll just make this like this. Oops. Like that there. So by default, even though this is visually only one-sided, it's going to block us on both sides. Like that. If we want this to act differently, we can make sure it's selected, go down here and click one-sided collision. Now the way this will work is the side that is inside here, so the side that is visible by default, will block the player or any actors it's defined to, but the other side it will not. So we can now just walk straight through this. And that's, so even if we have the camera here where we can see it, we can walk straight through it, but we can't walk back. So this is useful for a lot of action games have like combat arenas. So like God of War comes to mind, the original God of Wars on PS2. You would enter a zone, there would be a bunch of enemies spawn, you wouldn't be able to leave until you finished defeating all the enemies. We can also invert the direction of the one-sided collision. So in this case, we would be able to walk through this way, but not back this way, stopping us there. Obviously, the visuals are still on the other side, so you would probably want to use a double-sided one there. It's just an option to set that up. If you want to see the direction the collision is in, so let's turn off inverted. We're just going to skip down to this one here, show collision direction. That will show you that if the player walks into this, they're going to be pushed this way. So that works for both active and passive. It's just showing you the direction the collision is pushing back on. If we click invert, it's going to move to the other side. And if we turn it off, it'll go away because it's not useful when it's doing both sides. Next, we have the launch speed. So this one here is set up with the default launch speed of 600. If we change this to, say, 2000, that's going to launch the player a lot more on this little one. So this is a 600. This is a 2000. Oh, I have to turn that to an active blocking volume, my bad. Let's try that again. So this is 600. This is 2000. And that's actually launched us right over the top of the external wall. But you get the idea. So that is a setting to give you control over that. Optimize spline on begin play. So this is a setting that is going to take a really big spline and break it up into smaller ones. Now, if you have a system of culling objects in your game, or if you're using world partition or something like that, this should, in theory, give you a little bit more control over the performance. I'm not sure how long the spline is. Let's just quickly get a rough idea. If I can remember how to measure. Yep, there we go. So we're looking at, it's what, 2,000, 8,800 plus a little bit on these corners. So this one's probably about 12,000 units long, the spline, at a guess. If we were to set this to be 2,000, then what it's going to do is it's going to break this one big spline up into a bunch of smaller splines. Now, I think I can visualize this in here if I go show splines. No, I can't because the spline gets deleted at the end. Oh no, there is spline there. It's just very hard to see. I wonder if I disable the... I need to actually turn this on as well. If I disable the material, it's probably going to be a bit easier to see. Turn show splines on again. Oh, that's now hidden the splines as well. Why is that so difficult to see? Okay, let's leave this on, but let's turn the base color and grid off. Hopefully we can see this. Show splines. No, it's not really too easy. Or you can see that. So we measured this distance and we saw that it was 2,200. So from this point over to here is 2,000. So this is one spline actor from that point to that point over there. And it's going to go along, it's going to take another 2,000 units, and this is where that next actor goes, and so on. So that is a system to break the spline up into smaller splines. Now you are going to get, there is a chance that there's going to be some little hiccups in the curve with that because it's generating the splines on the fly. And you can't manually set the tangents. It tries to take the tangents from the point in the spline, but you may see little hiccups. So in general, what I would recommend doing is trying to use multiple splines if you're doing a particularly big one. But that option is there for you. The engine is also really good at optimizing splines. So I believe in World Partition it will actually automatically load out the spline meshes. If you're not using World Partition, it's a little bit less well done, but yeah, there's definitely a bunch of perks to using splines for this sort of thing. Finally, in this setting, we have the trigger class, which we went over. That's just the different classes of trigger. And then we have a bunch of editor-only settings. So if I minimize all these, so we've got the distance fade on these volumes. So you can see the trigger there is fading in and out as we go in. That's really good at runtime. However, you might want to disable it just in the editor. So that's what this setting does. It'll still work at runtime. So you can see that as we fade away from that trigger, it's getting lighter, and as we get closer, it's getting darker. But in the editor, that does not happen. We've got the markable spline points, which just adds these handles here. That's really good for quickly identifying triggers against blocking volumes and also for quickly selecting the spline, especially if you have the materials turned off. So if we go into material here and we disable the grid and we disable the base color, you can see we have the spline, which is a bit annoying to click, but the handles make it a lot easier. Then we have marker offset. That is just the height of the marker. So if for some reason you want to look way up in the air, you can do so. Show collision direction. We already demonstrated with this one. Generate the collision in the editor. So if you have collision turned on in the editor, by default, this is turned on. But if you want to not have it generate, you can turn this off on a per spline basis. And this can be really useful for just if you're trying to work with collision around the spline, or you're trying to make it a little bit more responsive. Because if you end up with a very complicated or very big spline, the generation of the collision is actually the thing that makes the editing of the spline most sluggish. So if you turn this off, that can give you a little bit of a boost while you still get all the material updates and that. However, if that is not enough, you can completely disable the updates and all you will see is the spline. And then once you are done, you can just turn the updates back on and it'll generate your spline. So that is all the settings. Hopefully that video is helpful. If you have any questions or feedback about this system, feel free to let me know in the comments below or on the Discord. There is both the Discord and the written documentation. Links are in the description. And thank you very much for watching.